Take a look at this chart here, and you'll notice something that might be interesting to you, and perhaps something that you're already aware of. But if you take a look at recent statistics, you're going to notice that the financial problems are mounting both in American households and in our government. Debates are ongoing among American legislators about hiking interest rates, about raising the debt ceiling, even some talk going on of bailouts again. And meanwhile, the past 2 years of increased inflation are taking a toll on American families. Back in 2008, certainly most of us are uh, old enough to remember 2008. I could go back to, the 1979, 1980 Jimmy Carter years, which I'm not really old enough to remember, but I was only just born in 1979. But some of you are old enough to remember that. Things were pretty tough in those days as well. But back in 2008, the economy took a nosedive. We went to a period of recession. And a quick look at this chart would indicate that household debt has hit highs over the past year or two, not seen since 2008. So signs would indicate that our economy is nearing a recession. I want you to take a look at this next chart and notice what the typical American household looks like. And what you'll find is that Americans are heavily in debt. Americans are in the red. A big chunk of our debt is mortgage debt, as the average cost of a household climbed over the past 4 or 5 years pretty sharply. Mortgage debt has increased. The average mortgage debt is $172,000. But another part of it is student loan debt. The average household owes $49,000 student loan debt. That's a lot of debt. Others have expensive auto loans that they pay monthly. Average auto loan debt is $28,000. And the typical American household has $16,000 in credit card debt, according to the New York Federal Reserve. So for many, this amount of debt is causing a financial crisis. And so in today's lesson, what we want to do is look at the scriptures to think about overcoming financial crisis. And so before we even get into it, I'm going to tell you this is not a political sermon. I'm not here to preach politics to you. I don't do that. This is not a health and wellness or prosperity gospel sermon. I'm not a qualified financial advisor. I'm certainly not a perfect example in all things either. This is not professional advice. All I can do as a gospel preacher is give you the wisdom that God gives through his word. And so what we say today is mostly limited to the divine wisdom of the scriptures. So before we start thinking about overcoming financial problems, I do think it's important for us to think about why some people are in a state of financial crisis. And so I want to think about 10 financial hardships, 10 reasons we might be in financial hardship. And some of those reasons are uncontrollable. I don't think we can say that every time somebody's in financial hardship, well, that's your fault. Sometimes it's not your fault. Sometimes it was through no fault of your own. Some financial hardships are uncontrollable. Natural disasters and tragedies occur. The early church in Acts 11 was hit with a famine that led to the need for others from other churches to send relief from Antioch to Jerusalem. They needed the relief from their brothers and sisters to help them through that difficult time. And likewise, we cannot control when earthquakes are going to hit. We can't control if a tornado takes out our house or our church building. We can't control whether we get hit by a hurricane if we're living on the coastline. We can't control whether it's going to be a season of drought, and if you're a farmer, it takes out your profit for that year. There are just some things that we cannot control. We cannot control when we have the loss of a key financial provider in our household. Uh, Husbands are supposed to work if they're capable of working. But if you lose your husband because your husband has either passed away, we lose husbands sometimes because of divorce through no fault of our own, and sometimes we lose fathers through death. God has always had compassion upon the widow, upon the orphan, upon the foreigner. We cannot control the loss of a husband, father, or sometimes we can't control the wars or the political anarchy that leads to an evacuation of our homeland, where we're forced to try to move somewhere else where we can live and practice our faith and freedom without threat um, from our government. James 1:27 says, pure and undefiled religion before God and the Father is this: visit orphans and widows in their trouble and keep yourself unspotted from the world. And so we're to care for orphans and widows because God has compassion upon them. Of course, there's a process to how that happens. In 1 Timothy 5:16, it says, if any believing man or a woman has widows, let them relieve them. So if we have family members who are widows, we're the first line of defense for them in our families. Do not let the church be burdened, that it may relieve those who are really widows. And so the church steps in after the family cannot cover the expense. Sometimes we might have poverty that's brought on by persecution. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 18, it says that, verse 19, let's go there. This is commendable if because of conscience toward God, one endures grief, suffering wrongfully. You may, because you're a Christian, you may receive some sort of financial hardship that's a result of your faith. In Hebrews chapter 11, that was certainly the case. It says some people had trials of mockings and scourgings and of chains and imprisonment. Some people of faith were stoned and sawn in two, were tempted and slain with the sword, and they wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins. They were destitute, afflicted, and tormented, of whom the world was not worthy, and they wandered in deserts and mountains and dens and caves of the earth. The more our world goes woke, the more sometimes Christians may suffer as the result of it, when they're not willing to go along with some of the things that take place in the workplace. Jesus anticipated that. He anticipated the persecution of his disciples. In Matthew 5, it says, blessed are you if you're persecuted for righteousness' sake. And such persecution can lead to economic upheaval in our lives when that takes place. Well, sometimes people suffer because of disability or impairment. Our biggest financial asset is our ability to work. And if you do not have the ability to work, then that ruins financial opportunity and it will lead to hardship. But in John chapter 9, Jesus did not blame the blind man for being blind. This was certainly through no fault of his own. And so sometimes that's part of our hardship. And sometimes we suffer hardship because of unlawful people. Sometimes people come and they steal our stuff, and they burglarize our home. Sometimes we invest our money into a Ponzi scheme, and we find out that the people that we trusted to handle our money rightly handled it in a wrong way. Sometimes people embezzle money from us. Sometimes we get hit by an uninsured driver and we end up having to pick up the bill or suffer the consequences. You know, the man on the road to Jericho, he was injured, he was beaten, he was robbed. And sometimes those sorts of things happen to us through no fault of our own. Lawless men can cause us to suffer severe financial heartache. But some hardships are within our control. And when that's the case, then we need to self-examine. Sometimes we suffer financial hardship because we've made a poor choice in whom we've chosen to do business with. We need to be careful who you do business with. Proverbs 6 says, my son, if you become surety for your friend, if you have shaken hands and pledged for a stranger, you are snared by the words of your mouth. You are taken by the words of your mouth. Proverbs chapter 22, verses 26 and 27 says, do not be one of those who shakes hands in a pledge, one of those who is surety for debt. Sometimes we co-sign a loan. You shouldn't co-sign a loan. The book of Proverbs says you shouldn't co-sign a loan. The reason why you shouldn't co-sign a loan is because if they didn't have good enough credit in the first place, that tells you something about the financial lenders who are foaming at the mouth to lend money, that they're not even willing to sign a loan for them. And if you put your name on that paper, then you're going to have to pay that debt if they fail to pay it. And they have a history clearly of failing to pay the debt. So it says, if you shake hands in a pledge and that person doesn't have anything to pay with, sometimes they're going to take your bed out from under you. So sometimes we do business with people we shouldn't be doing business with, and we choose to have partnerships with people we shouldn't do partnerships with. Sometimes our own financial problems are laziness. Sometimes it's a lack of foresight. We didn't look ahead. You know, Proverbs 6 talks about the ant that works during the summer so that it can be prepared for the winter. And sometimes we don't look ahead to the hard times, and we spend what we have during the good times, and we fail to learn the lesson of the ant. In Luke chapter 15, sometimes we play the prodigal. We ask our parents for all of our inheritance, and then we go out and waste it on prodigal living, living the high life, and then we have nothing left. And the biggest favor you can do for someone who has spent everything on sinful living is not give them anything, so they can wake up and realize they need to start living life God's way so they don't put themselves in that type of situation again. You notice the prodigal didn't come to his senses until people quit bailing him out. And when people quit bailing him out, he learned his lesson. But sometimes it's laziness. There's a lot of people during COVID, they were getting a whole bunch of COVID money, getting a lot of COVID checks, and they sat around and they spent that money and they were hoping they were going to get another COVID check, and then they didn't, and then they ended up being broke. Should have had a little bit of foresight. Money just can't keep getting handed out, right? Or you might run out. Well, sometimes it's dishonesty that is the reason why we're suffering. You know, if you steal, and if you embezzle, and if you extort, and if you pilfer, and you get fired for it, that might lead to a loss of job. It also is going to lead to a loss of reputation. Nobody's going to refer you at that point. It's going to be harder for you to get a job when you have that on your record and when your references know that about you. And so sometimes our own financial hardship is due to things that we could have avoided had we done business honestly. Proverbs 6 says, people do not despise a thief if he steals to satisfy himself when he's starving, but when he is found, he must restore sevenfold. You're going to pay the consequences if you steal and if you do things that are unlawful. You have troubled your house and you will reap the consequences. Sometimes, though, we struggle with financial hardship because we've presumed and we've assumed. And James 4 says, you who say tomorrow we're going to go and buy and sell and we're going to make ourselves a really big profit. I think sometimes people promise us big loads of money in get-rich-quick schemes. And I would warn you not to get involved in things like that. Be very careful. Be extremely cautious and extremely discreet. Be careful of giving up the consistency of regular work for the promise of money tomorrow by marketing companies and schemes. Sometimes we bring hardship upon ourselves. That's not for everybody. And then sometimes it's our own greed. It's our own covetousness. Sometimes there's not enough money in the account to live the way that we're living. You know, we're trying to live a Cadillac life on a Pinto budget, right? Um, we, we need to be careful that we're not trying to live that kind of life. Our crisis can be due to our own greed and our own covetousness. You know, if you've got to go out and you've got to swipe the credit card to finance your meal at McDonald's, you should question whether or not you're making good financial decisions. Overspending, over swiping, that leads to an overabundance of debt, and the one who is in debt to the lender is a slave to the lender. And we pierce ourselves through with many sorrows because of our greed. And so sometimes financial hardships are out of our control, and sometimes they are in our control, and we need to self-examine. Okay, so whether it's out of your control or in your control, I want to think with you about what are some keys to overcoming some of those financial hardships as we look at Scripture. And it starts really here. Number one is this: you need to own up to your personal mistakes and sins. So if there are things that are within your control that you can fix and that you've done wrong, well, you need to admit it. You're never going to fix a problem if you do not admit you have a problem. You really can't help somebody to make better financial decisions if they don't admit that they haven't made good financial decisions. If one of the reasons You don't have money to pay your bills is because you quit your job or you didn't show up to your job and you got rightfully fired from your job and you squandered your money, then you need to take some personal responsibility for the situation that you're in and quit blame shifting. And that's biblical. Proverbs 28:13 says, whoever conceals his transgressions will not prosper. He who confesses and forsakes them will obtain mercy. And so we have to admit when we haven't been as wise as we should be or when we've brought problems upon ourselves. James 5:16 says, confess your trespasses to one another and pray for one another that you may be healed. And 1 John 1:9 says, if we confess our sins, he is faithful and just to forgive us our sins and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. Now, God can forgive your sins, but that's not going to fix your debt problem. So we're going to have to think a little bit more about how do we fix the debt problem. So first, though, we've got to admit that we've got a problem. Second, when you realize that you have a problem or that you're in need of help, you're in need of wisdom, then pray. We need to pray for it. James 1:5 says, if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given him. Solomon, when he's given one thing that he could pray for, one thing he could ask for from God, he prays for wisdom. He was unsure of how he could manage a kingdom, just like sometimes we're unsure. How can I manage how can I manage my budget? How can I manage my life? How can I manage my household? Well, pray for wisdom. And God not only gave him wisdom, but he also blessed him with the financial prosperity that helped him to build his kingdom in a way like no other king before. God calls us to pray for wisdom, and it can lead to financial blessing. And so we pray. It's one of the things we need to do. A third thing, though, is that if you've got yourself into a financial mess, then you may need to accept God's discipline. Accept God's discipline. Hebrews 12:10 says this, talks about our earthly fathers. They disciplined us for a short time as it seemed best to them, but he disciplines us for our good, that we may share his holiness. For the moment, all discipline seems painful rather than pleasant, but later it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. So, confessing the mistakes, praying is not going to make the consequences go away. And so, what we're going to have to realize is that if we've got ourselves into a problem, times might be tough. Times might be tough when you try to crawl out of debt. You've got to tighten up the money that's going out. You've got to find a way to increase the money that's coming in, and that means sacrifice. You've got to quit spending on something, and you maybe have to work a little harder than you're used to increase the money to pay off the debt that you've accumulated. And that's going to hurt. And sometimes that's God's chastening. That's God's disciplining. Most of the times we didn't get into debt overnight, and you're not going to correct it overnight. And the hurt may last for a while, depending on how deep you are in these financial problems. Some people can get out of it really quick. Some people, it might take years, but God chastens us so that we can remember the pain and so that we can avoid it the next time that we are tempted to fall into those financial traps. And so we have to accept God's chastening. There are going to be tough times as we try to get through it. A fourth thing that I would say, if you're going to overcome, is listen to wise counsel. Listen to wise counsel. Proverbs 12:15 says, the way of a fool is right in his own eyes. If you just keep making mistake after mistake and you don't talk to someone who maybe either has made those mistakes and has learned from them. Dave Ramsey's big line is he's been bankrupt twice, but I guess he's learned from it, right? Everybody quotes Dave Ramsey. He's been bankrupt twice, but, but he's learned from it, okay? So talk to people who have some wisdom, who have learned from their mistakes, or people who have done things the right way, and listen to their counsel. Because if you keep getting yourself into trouble, then maybe the problem is that you need to listen to someone who could help. Proverbs 15:22 says, without counsel, plans go awry, but in the multitude of counselors, they are established. And so ask advice from financial winners. There are people who have done well with their money and with their finances, and perhaps they can help you and be a guide to you to help you work through some of those problems. Sometimes we need to be willing to hear hard things from them. They may not be telling you what you want to hear, but hopefully if they're good at what they're doing and they've done a good job themselves, they might tell you what you need to hear. And it might be hard things from honest counselors. So seek out spiritual advisors. You can also read books that have biblical principles that may help. So be willing to read, be willing to learn, be willing to put it into action. Talk to people who have been in your shoes and overcome. Most of you know, when I had COVID, I was in the hospital for 6 days. We got hit with some financial bills that I certainly was not expecting. I did not think, I was just one of those people. I'm healthy. I don't take any medicine. If I get COVID, I'll be fine. And I ended up in the hospital for 6 days. And so we got hit with it was at the first a $26,000 COVID hospital bill. And when I got that, I was like, you gotta be kidding me, you know? Um, but I talked to some people who worked in the billing department at hospitals, people who had been through health issues themselves. And they said, hey, why don't you, first of all, get an itemized bill, which I did. And I found there was, $2,000 worth of charges on there that they had never administered. So that cut it down to 24. That's good. That's $2,000 I didn't have to pay. And then they said, why don't you apply for charity aid through the hospital? I didn't know I could apply for charity aid through the hospital, but thankfully I qualified for charity aid through the hospital. That dropped my bill from $24,000 to $4,000. That's a 20,000. That's good. That's awesome. But if I hadn't listened to anybody and never talked to anybody about those problems and kind of, worked through it, I would have never known about those things. When we moved here, we were trying to find a way maybe to get Hattie in a private school or a Christian school or something. I never thought I would be able to afford going or sending my kid to a Christian school. I just always thought, that's way too expensive. I can't handle that. And somebody said, hey, there's this school choice scholarship they have. And if you apply for it, maybe you can get it. And I did. And we still pay a little bit more than we would for public school, but it's within reason. But if nobody had ever told me that, I ever talked to anybody, I wouldn't know about those things. Talk. Sometimes be open about your situation and get advice from other people and listen to what they have to say. Listen to advice. People who have been to college, people who have suffered through college debt, people who maybe can give you some advice on it. If I had to do it all over again, maybe this is how I would do it. Listen to some of that advice that people might give you. We are called to be good stewards, and people can help you not be one of those people who owes $49,000 in student loan debt. Fifth, create a workable budget. Create a workable budget. Proverbs 21 and verse 5 says, the plans of the diligent lead surely to abundance, but everyone who is hasty comes only to poverty. The disciples understood budgeting. Jesus said, hey, these people are hungry. And Philip said, we've only got 5 loaves and 2 fishes. How are we going to feed them all? What did he understand? Well, we have 5,000 people. We've got 5 loaves and 2 fish. So either the people need to leave and go eat, or we need more food, and Jesus takes care of it. You don't have a Jesus that can take care of it, right? Not in that way today, all right? So the budget, the goal of it is that you either need to increase the revenue or decrease what's going out, or both, so that you can have a workable budget. Budget's pretty simple. For some people, they just jot it down on a Post-it note. Some people, they got like 4 pieces of paper and an Excel spreadsheet and like they're very, very big into their budget. But it's really simple. Expenses on one side, income on the other side, totals on the bottom. And voila. And the income, here's the magic part of it. The income has to figure up higher than the expenses. And if it doesn't, then something's got to happen. Either something's got to be cut from the left-hand side, or something has to be added to the right-hand side, or both. Now, not a lot of people like a budget, but it's kind of like a diet. The calories are on one side, the intake is on the other side, and if you want to gain weight, just keep eating. But if you want to lose weight, cut your intake. That's just how it works. Dave Ramsey, he covers several money myths in his book, The Total Money Makeover. And one myth he notes is when people say, I don't have time to work on a budget or retirement plan or estate plan. And Ramsey says, you don't have time not to. And he quotes from John Maxwell, who once said, a budget is people telling their money where to go instead of wondering where it went. So we have to learn to budget. Now, what is that budget made out of? Well, that leads us to our sixth point here. What do we do essentially with a budget? Well, one of the things we do, cut wasteful spending. We have to cut wasteful spending. In Luke 15, verses 11 through 13, it says, there was a man who had 2 sons, and the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the share of property that is coming to me. And he divided his property between them. And not many days later, the younger son gathered all he had, took a journey to a far country, and he squandered his property in reckless living. Now, maybe we don't squander our entire inheritance or something like that, but there's times that we just make foolish decisions and wasteful spending, and we blow money. We blow money on a lot of different things. You can blow a lot of money on fast food. You can blow a lot of money on, fares and entertainment, things that we don't need to have. You don't have to go to the movies. You don't have to go to the museums. You don't have to go to the ball games. We spend a lot of money on fashion. Spend a lot of money on clothes and purses and decor. So what do you need to cut from your monthly budget? I mean, do you really need 7 different movie channel subscriptions? If you look through your budget, sometimes you're going to notice, I'm subscribing to like 10 different monthly paid subscriptions. I think I need to cut some of those. And you could save yourself a little money. Do you really need the huge cable package? Do you really need to go out to eat when you could have stayed home and you could have cooked the same thing for half the price? Do you really need to book that vacation? You don't have to go vacation. And if you're in financial trouble, maybe you shouldn't. Did you really need to pay that person to paint your nails, to do your lashes, to spray on the fake tan? Do your kids need to play 3 different travel sports? Those cost money. Did you need that furniture? Could there have been a more affordable way to make that purchase? Do you need a car that's new, or could you have lowered your car payment by patiently shopping for a used or less expensive brand? Do you need that $7 coffee at Starbucks every day, or could you buy a bag of beans for about the same amount and make enough coffee for the whole week? Do you really need to drink pop when you go out to eat, when you could save $3 a person by just drinking water? We just had this conversation at lunch with our kids today. Do we really need to go into debt every Christmas and every birthday, or could we communicate with our families, hey, times are tight for us right now. Can we just spend time together and share a meal without killing ourselves financially? Is that okay? And I think hopefully your family would be understanding of that. We could go on, but sometimes our budget is death by 1,000 cuts, and we are slowly bleeding out because we mentally think that a buck or two here and a buck or two there won't hurt. And over time, those little cheats do hurt. So you have to cut wasteful spending. You guys ever had this conversation with one another? Yeah, I'm sure you have. Hopefully. If you haven't, you're going to have it tonight. Number 7, work more. If there's not enough coming in to cover the debt, then the next thing you got to do is this. You got to work more to increase the amount of money that's coming in. Acts 18. Paul didn't always have enough coming in to cover his needs. And so what did he do in chapter 18 when he got to Corinth? Well, he found a Jew named Aquila, who was a native of Pontus, who recently had come from Italy with his wife Priscilla. And because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them and worked, for they were tent makers by trade. There's nothing wrong with getting a second job. Paul did it. He's a tent maker, and that's okay. In Acts 20, 34 and 35, Paul was able to say, you yourselves know that these hands have provided for my necessities and for those who are with me. And I have shown you in every way by laboring like this that you must support the weak. Paul was, at least in some points of his ministry, bivocational. There were times that he received support. We know that from other letters that he wrote and other passages, but there were times that he was willing to work as well. So what do we have to do sometimes? Just like Paul, but we've got to find a way to increase some income. Can we sell anything around our house we don't need? If you don't have assets to sell, then what do you need to do? Well, your greatest asset is your ability to work. Now, some people say, oh, you shouldn't work more because you'd have to be away from home more. Well, that's true, and I would tell you that's true typically, but we're talking about special circumstances here. You aren't making enough to pay the bills with one job alone. You aren't making enough to crawl out of debt. Special times require special actions. So, quite frankly, especially with young single people, I would tell you, I don't think there's anything wrong with working two jobs. It may keep you out of trouble. Save while you can. You're young. You've got energy. I promise you, the energy is going to decline. So pay down the debt while you can. Get that furniture you're going to need while you can. Because once you get married, you start having kids, your time to work is going to get cut and your expenses are going to go up. And so save while you can, while you're young. Make some money now. Go get a side hustle. Man, so what else does it mean if we increase revenue? Well, you might have to work a little overtime if your job's willing to give you overtime. Maybe you take a second job. Maybe it's a seasonal job. Some people just kind of work during the holiday season just to bring in a little extra income. Maybe it's a little side hustle. There's all kinds of little side hustles out there now. You can Uber, you can Lyft, you can Instacart, you can DoorDash, you can deliver pizzas. There's a lot of things that we can do. In my years of preaching, I've had a lot of side jobs. I've never picked up an hourly job that interferes with my Sundays or my Wednesdays or my gospel meeting work, but I found little flexible side jobs that just helped with the extras. I've substitute taught, I've mowed yards, I've trimmed people's shrubs, I've sold insurance, I've plowed snow. I even was the travel director of my kid's soccer club, a job that I hated, but so that my kid could play for free because it's not cheap. So it was free. There's things you do sometimes just to help increase the revenue, to help the budget. And sometimes that's what we've got to be willing to do. Keep in mind, if you do the hard work now, you're going to be able to live a more abundant, debt-free life later. But just sometimes you got to work more. Now, number 8, be content with the necessities, though. 1 Timothy 6 says, we brought nothing into the world, and we cannot take anything out of the world. But if we have food and clothing, with these we shall be content. That's really, according to Paul, the necessities. You have food to eat. You need that. That's a necessity. And you have clothes to wear. He doesn't even mention housing, which is interesting to me. He says you got food to eat and you have clothing. With these, we shall be content. Philippians 4, he speaks to his travels and the situations that he had been in. And he says, not that I'm speaking of being in need. He says, I have learned in whatever situation I am to be content. It's a key word that I want you to see in that phrase. I have learned. Learned. I don't think contentment is natural. We're naturally discontent. We are naturally greedy. We are naturally want more and more and more. My grandmother used to talk to me in the book of Proverbs about the verse that talks about the leeches. She said some people are like leeches. They just cry, give, give. There's this passage in Proverbs, and they're just never satisfied with enough. And so God calls us to be content with the necessities. We need to be candid about what are wants and what are necessities, and learn contentment. That's a process. It's a process, but I think it's a process that sometimes when you have not been content and you've made mistakes, well, you learn from those financial choices and purchases and your regret, and you learn really quickly, I would have been better off had I done what God said and just been content with the basics. There's an old song, I'm satisfied with just a cottage below, a little silver and a little gold. That's a song about contentment. Just, I just got the basic things that I need. I'm okay with that because I'm not living for this earth. This world is not my home. Just want the necessities. So, number nine, keys to overcoming: pursue God instead of money. Quit making money your pursuit. Money is just a tool so that you can have what you need, so that you can live for God in this life. You do have to work. You do have to have that money to have those things, but your ultimate pursuit is not those material things. You're not going to take any of those outfits with you, right? You're not going to take the cars with you, the home staying here. Somebody else is just going to inherit all the money in your bank account. And so it's not the most important thing. 1 Timothy 6:10 says, the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil, and it is through this craving that some have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many pangs. But as for you, O man of God, flee these things. That's the love of money and any sinful pursuit. Instead, pursue righteousness. Pursue to be right with the Lord. Pursue godliness, a godly character. Pursue faith. Pursue love. Pursue steadfastness, and pursue gentleness. One of the things that Solomon learned when you read the book of Ecclesiastes, which is one of my favorite books to teach out of, one of the things that you learn from Solomon is that he had tried to find, happiness and purpose and so many things. And at the very end of the book, he figures out that, you know what, it wasn't in the gardens, and it wasn't in the nice home, and it wasn't in having lots of servants, and it wasn't in having a big table full of the finest food that anyone could eat for miles around. The most important thing, because all those things are going to get left behind, is my relationship with God, who's going to hold me accountable one day. What's the purpose of man? Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is man's all. That's what's going to matter in the end. And if you're living for things here on earth, and that's your ultimate purpose and satisfaction, well, you're living for something that is not going to satisfy. Not long term, not in eternity. And so Solomon would say, live for something that's going to satisfy for eternity. And that's living for God. Well, our last point is this. If you followed all these steps, you've admitted that you could have perhaps done something wrong here and you need to fix some things. You've prayed for wisdom. You've talked to financial counselors. You've begun to establish a budget so you can start figuring out on your own, how much is coming in, how much is going out, and started to cut some of the things that you didn't need to be spending money on, and try to find ways to increase the revenue that's coming in to the best of your ability. You follow these steps. Then after all these steps, if you're still in dire circumstances, well, then ask for help. It's okay to sometimes admit we need help and to talk to other people about what we need help with. Ruth and Naomi, they were facing a famine in their homeland. They had lost their breadwinners, and they decided we need to go back to Bethlehem. But when they went back to Bethlehem, they had to go glean in Boaz's field just to find some help. And thankfully, he was a gracious, wealthy man. He also happened to be a close relative who had the right to marry Ruth, who blessed her with a child and blessed her abundantly. But it took a lot of humility for them to go back to that homeland and say, you know what, things aren't going well and we need help. And that's okay. And there are compassionate people out there and people who understand. And sometimes we're in circumstances that are not our own. And sometimes we are in circumstances that are our fault. But one way or the other, if you need help, you need help. Matthew 5:42 says, our responsibility as Christians, give to him who asks you. And sometimes people need help. From him who wants to borrow from you, do not turn away. And Ephesians 4:28 says, one of the reasons we do work is, first of all, because if you want money, you don't steal it. That's not one way to make money. So let him who stole steal no longer. That might have been how you operated before you were a Christian, but now that you're a Christian, you work. You work. That's God's means for providing for yourself. Labor. Working with your hands what is good. Why? So you can provide for yourself and your family, but so that you can have something to give him who has need. And sometimes people ask for help. And so when they ask for help, be willing to help. Brethren cannot help if they are not aware of a problem. And it's better that you ask for help before the problem becomes extremely worse, and get that good financial advice and help that you need before some of your issues become almost insurmountable. So after all these steps, when you're in dire circumstances, ask for help. 1 Corinthians 10:13 says this, no temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. People have had money problems before, and people are going to keep on having money problems. You're not going through anything different than what a lot of other people have gone through. That's what this passage says. There's a lot of other ways in which people have gone through terrible temptations and difficult trials as well. But God is faithful, and he will not let you be tempted beyond your ability. There is nothing that you can't handle. He is with the temptation going to provide the way of escape that you may be able to endure it. And so if your temptation and if the trials you're facing are financial trials, then use this verse and use it as comfort and use it as encouragement in knowing that God can help you get through these trials. In full faith, trust him. Trust him to help you get through those things, and he can help you to overcome.